The BBC are refusing to demonstrate moral clarity. And I say, shame on them.
Somehow our media seems unable to separate Hamas terrorists from ordinary Palestinians.
Let's challenge BBC journalists and producers and editors have got Twitter accounts, right, to post on their site, hashtag Hamas are terrorists.
And not just from the Jewish community, from Britain in general.
Let's see if they've got the courage to do it.
Has made quite big news recently. As Joseph, you've tweeted about quite a bit. The BBC refused to call Hamas terrorists. Joseph, what do you think?
The most disgraceful aspect of this is a few days after the largest massacre of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust, in an act of terror, the BBC ran headlines that there'd been a terror attack in Brussels. So the message is loud and clear. The BBC does not seek to take a side when one of those sides is Jewish or Israeli and the other is Palestinian, but when it's Europeans that are killed, they are very, very happy to call them terrorists, or there's no issue with them calling a terrorist a terrorist. Now, a terrorist, by definition, there will always be two sides because they seek to use unlawful violence to achieve a political aim. And for the BBC to say we can't be seen to take a side means they can never use the definition of the word terrorist by definition. But that's not the case. They use it all the time. Anyone can go on their website and search for the term terrorist, and you'll find article after article. The only time they consistently refuse to use it is in reference to Israeli Jewish victims of terror. And this was terror. This was terrorism. This was it was terrorism on a scale we have not seen before. And proportionate to the size of the population, it was much bigger than the Twin Towers. And even in proportion to the population, it was the second largest terror attack since the Twin Towers. Yet they refuse to call it what it is. And that is deeply, deeply disturbing because it's not about remaining neutral. In not calling it terrorism, they are taking a side and they are giving cover and legitimacy to some of the most brutal terrorists that the world has witnessed.
I also think if they're trying to say, those at the BBC who claim to be professionally neutral but they're not, that this is a terrible dispute, that there's some kind of occupation taking place here. Let's be clear. Israel was asked by the world to vacate Gaza in 2005. It's precisely what they did. They left Gaza. They were asked to do so and leave the Palestinians to govern themselves. So they did that. Within hours of them doing that, they were faced with violent attacks. Hamas took over Gaza and they were faced with a terrorist organization on their border. That's what happened. That's a historical fact. It's not an opinion. It's an absolute fact. Okay? So even if the BBC want to claim, well, it's a complex situation because the Palestinians, have a claim to some of this land and all the rest of it, Israel left Gaza. They did what the world asked of them. And all they had in return since 2005 is constant violence, attacks, and terrorism. So for me, this is the most disgraceful failure of an organisation that usually I'm quite proud of, the BBC. The quality of the BBC's journalists on the whole around the world is quite good. It has one blind spot, and then that's when it covers anything to do with Israel, where it seems absolutely incapable of being professionally neutral and objective. I'll give you the main example I would give you, Eli, is there was a report commissioned a number of years ago, and the report was specifically commissioned into whether the BBC's coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was independent, objective and fair. Nobody yet has seen this report. It has never been published. It has never seen the light of day, and the BBC have never been prepared to share it with anybody. Why do you think that is? I'll tell you why it is. It must have been so damning, right, about the lack of professionalism and the lack of objectivity and the lack of independence. That's why it hasn't seen the light of day. So there's a long history of, within the BBC, an institutional approach to Israel that can only be described as anti-Semitism because it differentiates one minority, one set of victims, singles them out and treats them differently than any other minority and any other set of victims. So that has to be called out as anti-Semitism. It's absolutely anti-Semitism, and it's institutional. This is in the great British Broadcasting Company, Corporation, and they should be ashamed of themselves. These are intelligent people, by the way, who sit round the board table there and debate these issues. They're not just a random group. They debate it. They've discussed it. They could have said in this conflict, okay, we've maintained this position over many years. In view of Hamas's behaviour last weekend, we have to acknowledge they are terrorists. They can't even bring themselves to do that. And it is truly shocking. This is in a country where the Prime Minister, in my view, when he got him in the House of Commons, he described what the barbarism of last weekend as a pogrom. The leader of the opposition has spoken in similar terms. So the political class, on this occasion, so far in the concepts of this war, has said all the right things. If this is a battle between good and evil, and I believe it is, I believe that this war symbolises the ultimate battle, is a symbol of the ultimate battle between good and evil in the world. And there is no room for equivocation, no room for timidity, okay? In that battle, the BBC are refusing to demonstrate moral clarity. And I say, shame on them. Now, have I witnessed in the last week myself positive and balanced and reasonable reporting from BBC journalists? Yes, I have. I was on a BBC programme this week, Manchester. I felt the journalist was certainly professional and certainly balanced. Until I asked the question about justifying why they don't use the term terrorism. Then he simply read out the BBC management script. And what I'm interested to know is this. Let's issue a challenge on this podcast tonight. When Gary Lineker was denied the right to freedom of speech, allegedly, okay, wherever you stood, that's what happened, all his colleagues and his peers went on strike. They said, we're not having Gary Lineker treated like this. We're going to rally behind Gary because he's being treated unfairly. All he has done is express a legitimate opinion. Let's not get into a debate about that opinion and whether he was right or wrong. Where are the journalists, the editors, the producers in the BBC? Where are they? Why haven't they got a voice? Why aren't they saying publicly and loudly that their management has got it wrong and is letting their organisation down by adopting this stance? So I issue a challenge on your podcast tonight to any BBC journalist or any BBC reporter, any BBC editor, or any BBC producer has got the guts. And why don't they organise, by the way, a petition or a group action, okay, and stand up to their bosses on this issue? Because it is absolutely shocking.
Joseph, do you want to join in Ivan with that?
I think it's a fantastic challenge. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we're going to like the result of that challenge. But please, if there are any of you that want to stand in solidarity with us and call a terrorist when they murder Jews as well as Europeans, then...
Joseph, let's challenge BBC journalists and producers and editors have got Twitter accounts, right, to post on their site, hashtag Hamas are terrorists. Let's challenge them to do that, Eli. Right? They don't have to say anything in detail. They don't have to go into a long diatribe about their views about the history of the conflict or the current war. Put on their respective Twitter sites or their Facebook sites, hashtag Hamas are terrorists. And they will see the welcome they will get for that integrity and that decency and doing the right thing. Let's see if they've got the courage to do it.
And not just from the Jewish community, from Britain in general, because I've encountered so many outraged British people from all. And
the decent majority in this country, the decent majority.
We have no issue calling ISIS terrorists in Syria because we can differentiate ISIS from Syrians. We can differentiate ISIS from Iraqis. But somehow our media seems unable to separate Hamas terrorists from ordinary Palestinians. And it's not just an insult to the victims of terror. It's not just an insult to Israelis and Jews. It's an insult to Palestinians to make this equivalency. If there was a Jewish terrorist operating from Israel, I would expect the BBC to call them terrorists and not to conflate them with me or not to conflate them with my family there, because there is a terrorist is a terrorist and a citizen is a citizen. They are not the same thing.
I mean, I want to say that last weekend it was last Sunday in Stamford Hill, there was a significant group of young Muslim males who went onto the streets of Stamford Hill entirely spontaneously with all sorts of banners saying Hamas not in our name. And I want to celebrate those young Muslim men on your programme here tonight. It demonstrates that they do not speak for the decent, ordinary majority of Muslims in this country or anywhere else, and that those young men had the courage, by the way, when maybe others didn't share that view, to come out and do that. So let's see some courage from these BBC journalists, producers and editors.